Net migration to the UK has seen a record fall, according to the Office for National Statistics. The figures stood at 431,000 in 2024. That's down almost 50% on the total in 2023. This is the biggest calendar year drop since the early stages of the pandemic. Now, joining me to make sense of these figures is Madeleine Sumption, who is the director of the Migration Observatory. Madeleine, thank you very much for chatting to me about this today. So go on then, should we be happy or delighted or worried about this?
I think people often talk about migration numbers as if more is either good or bad, and then and less is better or worse. And actually, if you're thinking about the impacts of migration, then obviously numbers do matter. They affect population growth. They affect the pace of social change in this country. People have very different opinions on that. But actually, the composition of migration, so who is coming, is in many respects just as important or often more important than how many people are coming, particularly if you're looking at something like public finances, for example. It matters a lot what skill levels of people we're talking about and so forth. So I think, it's neither good news nor bad news. It will reduce the pressure on the housing sector, having slightly lower levels of migration. At the same time, these are not dramatically low levels. If you take out the last few years and compare it to the level of net migration that we saw during the 2010s, this would be a record compared to that. So typically those numbers were around 200 to 300,000 in any given year.
So why have we seen such a steep fall then, do you think, Madeleine?
Well, I think the main reason that it was possible to have such a big decrease in migration was that migration levels previously had been unusually high under the post-Brexit immigration system. And the reasons for that are complicated, but effectively there was a policy liberalisation towards non-EU citizens. And then a lot of people took up those options more than expected. So, for example, the government introduced a route for care workers, expecting maybe a few thousand people to come, and then more than 100,000 care workers arrived in a single year, often bringing family members with them. So I think it was there was an unexpected increase because the response to the policy liberalisations from migrants themselves was so enthusiastic. And then, of course, when the numbers became very high, the previous government, then introduced some restrictive measures before the election last year, which brought the figures back down again. That was particularly focusing on preventing students and some workers from bringing their family members to the country, and a crackdown on exploitation in the care sector. So it's really what we're really seeing is sort of boom and bust under the post-Brexit immigration system. That the numbers were initially very high, and that enabled a very big reduction when some restrictions were brought in.
But nevertheless, a relief for the Prime Minister, no doubt, and he'll probably be lauding it as a success, no?
Well, of course, there's debates about who is responsible for the decrease. The policy measures that led to the decrease were introduced under the previous government. Obviously, the policy measures that led to the increase that made the decrease possible were also introduced under the previous government. Labour has not. They've made some policy changes, but not ones that directly affect these numbers. So I think what we're seeing here is really a result of both the increase and the decrease under the previous government rather than the current one.
Now, Madeleine, you said a little bit earlier in our chat that it was not a question of up or down, rise or fall. This is a case of who's coming, who's not. So who is no longer coming to the UK and who is?
Well, there are three main groups where we've seen reductions. The first is people on work visas. And a lot of that is people who were previously coming on health and care visas, particularly in the care sector, where there had been a very unexpectedly high number of people. There was also actually a lot of exploitation and abuse on that route, and the government then the previous government cracked down on employer sponsorship of care workers, which led to those lower numbers. We then also saw a bit later, introduced this towards the beginning of last year, there was a ban on international students bringing their family members, and indeed we've seen a big reduction in the number of partners and children of international students coming to the UK, and then a slightly smaller decrease in skilled workers bringing their family members, which probably results mostly from the ban on care workers in particular being able to bring their dependents, which the previous government introduced early last year.
Now, we're obviously talking about the plummeting numbers of people coming here, but these are plummeting numbers of people coming here to work and to study, we need these people, don't we? We need these to fund our universities, and we need these people working in our NHS and working in the fields, picking vegetables, and a whole host of other jobs. You know, what effect is this likely to have on the economy, do you think, if these numbers are dropping?
I think actually the effect is likely to be relatively small, and that's because, you know, we have to put this in context of what previously happened, right? So these are not dramatically low levels of migration we're seeing. We're just seeing a reversion to something a little bit more normal, still quite high compared.
But that's not how Sir Keir Starmer will frame it, surely.
No, I think so. You know, what we're seeing with the numbers are still quite high. So I don't think from an economic perspective, it's possible to describe these as devastatingly low numbers. I think in terms of the economic impacts of the decrease, the groups that have driven those decreases, you know, family members of international students, for example, are they're not the people who would have been expected to bring, you know, the highest net economic benefits, nor are they the people who would have required a lot of support and maybe presented an economic cost. They're somewhere in the middle, and that's one of the reasons that I think overall, actually, the impacts of this on the economy are likely to be relatively small.
Okay, so if we're focusing on net migration though, but also the people leaving the UK has gone up too. Should we be worried about that?
It's quite normal for people to leave the UK. What we see is that a lot of people who come here always plan to come here temporarily. Many of those are international students who might do their course, maybe they work for a little bit afterwards, but they would then typically go home. We've also seen over the last decades, people coming into jobs, skilled jobs, and things like the IT sector, professional services. Many of those people only ever plan to stay here temporarily. So what we tend to see is in periods when immigration is high, after a few years, you then start getting larger numbers of people leaving, and that's mostly just because they never intended to stay permanently in the first place.
Ah, I see. So perhaps they might be celebrating in number 10 today, or seeing this as a success that they own. But do you think that there's more work to be done? I mean, in terms of asylum seekers, for example?
I mean, clearly the government would like to reduce the numbers of asylum seekers. They have, they're a relatively small part of these statistics, although the numbers have increased over time. The issue from the government's perspective is that this is actually one of the categories that is least amenable to policy. So, for example, the previous government was relatively easily able to write a new regulation and say international students can't bring their family members, and immigration decreased as a result of that. It's much harder to do something like that when we're talking about asylum seekers and refugees. There are legal constraints on what the government can do. There are practical constraints of whether the government is able to return people that are refused refugee status. So that is a much harder area of policy to deal with than I think some of these visa categories that really are what drive the numbers we're seeing today.
In short, Madeleine, what do you think that are the policies that have worked then to reduce these numbers? I know you've alluded to some of them.
I think that the main reason that we're seeing these numbers it's effectively a combination of a crackdown that the previous government introduced on employers sponsoring care workers, responding to some of the reports of exploitation and abuse in that sector, plus the ban on international students and care workers bringing their family members. Those are the big policy measures that have contributed to the reduction. And of course, the previous liberalizations, because you can't have a reduction of net migration of 400,000 unless you're starting from a pretty high level. And so I think we have to see this in the context of the high levels of migration under the post-Brexit immigration system around 2022, 2023.
So us becoming an island of strangers, as Sir Keir Starmer said earlier in the week, is perhaps less likely now?
Oh, well, I'm just the humble data nerd. It's very difficult. What does it mean for us to be an island of strangers? How do you measure that? That is, I think something quite separate from these statistics.
Thank you very, very much for chatting to me, Madeleine. Lovely to talk to you. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.